Hey everybody, this is 5 of Clubs, and today I've got a little something different for the channel. Those of you who watched my Townsfolk Tussle, Aeon Trespass, and 4 Against Darkness videos might have known I'd been slowly tiptoeing my way toward a Kingdom Death Monster playthrough. In all the playthroughs so far that I've done, I've created short orientation preludes to get new viewers up to speed, but with Kingdom Death Monster it's a bit too big for my usual process.
That's a big Twinkie.
To be fair, there's a ton to be said for this game, and putting it all in a concise format is easier said than done. One of the community's most notable writers, Fen, has been writing new content about the game's lore, meta, and other aspects for years, so it's difficult to distill all of its unique aspects without depriving it due justice. Yet, undeterred, I set out to provide a summary explanation of the game experience toward the perspectives of those unfamiliar with the game. I won't go over every single keyword and component in the game, but by the end you should have a pretty good idea of what the game experience of Kingdom Death is like. Kingdom Death Monster is a 1 to 4 player cooperative horror tactical combat game with civilization evolution elements and RPG-esque roguelike character progression. That's a bunch of fancy talk to say that the game generally revolves around building a settlement of survivors who must defend their horror homestead from the nightmarish entities that adorn their hellscape. Kingdom Death Monster is the pioneer title of a new genre in board games called Complex AI Boss Battlers, or CABs for short, that put players through a gauntlet of increasingly difficult boss-like battle encounters. But before we dive into the game flow overview of the various portions of this massive game, I wanted to say a few words regarding the setting for the game to set the scene. The world portrayed in Kingdom Death Monster is different to anything I've ever seen in other board games. Picture an unexplored landscape, perpetually shrouded in shadow, with a sea of stone faces carpeting the ground for an indeterminable number of miles in all directions. As for what secrets those shadows conceal, I think much of that is best left to your own discovery, but suffice it to say, when the game is called Kingdom Death, you can confidently conclude it won't be sunshines and rainbows. Indeed, this is by far the darkest board game I've ever played. Traumas and nightmares previously unimaginable play out with regularity here in the world of Kingdom Death. Dismembered limbs, ruptured organs, broken bones, dozens and dozens of potential mental disorders, and all manner of debilitations and maulings await your survivors. Violence is coded generously between pockets of revolting gore and disquieting occurrences. New to a Hadean world where the threats set against them are actually at home in this purgatory, your poor survivors are but metaphorical infants, and thus the survivors begin the game lacking the basic capabilities of even primitive societies like language, heat, or anything beyond a Neanderthalic production capacity. The first time I saw an armor-clad entity approach my settlement, seemingly straight out of a medieval manga, my mind was blown. I was still fashioning bone shivs and hide vests together. I didn't even realize smithing was a known thing, or even that there were other human-esque entities in the shadows surrounding my people. But you can bet that when this armor-clad entity silently hefted its gleaming halberd into the neck of one of my survivors, instantly decapitating him, my mind drizzled out of my ears and I wanted to run for the stone-faced hills. And yet, your ultimate task in this game is to face such forces and survive, scratching and clawing your way through this vicious world, repelling the darkness that threatens your people with annihilation. That said, by the latter end of the campaign, perhaps your settlement will have progressed enough to face such foes with metal armaments of your own making. Like the game world itself, much of the story is similarly shrouded in shadow. You get story blurbs preceding timeline events and enemy encounters that reveal short thematic tidbits, but the deeper lore is found through the exploration of the game mixed with a procedural narrative specific to your survivors. Frankly, I don't understand the full entirety of the story myself, but it's neat to find your way to the answers for mysterious things, like, for example, why do your starting survivors have ink caked over their eyes, whereas newborn survivors do not? For me, the disquieting wonder of their reality is part of what fascinates and immerses me in the game world. I feel as though the setting would lose some of its threat if the lights were flicked on and it was fully revealed and understandable. The same holds true for the well-crafted horror movie monsters out there. Some of their intimidation factor is lost the more understandable they are as a threat. KDM leaves plenty for the mind to ponder as you wander the dark plane of stone faces, jutting stone noses prickling and prodding your bare feet along the way. But enough prose about the setting. What's the actual gameplay like? If viewed through a purely mechanical lens, the game is primarily about 3 phases that direct your progression through the chosen campaign: the Showdown Phase, the Settlement Phase, and the Hunt Phase. Wash, rinse, and repeat. For the sake of clarity, I'll be sticking to the standard People of the Lantern campaign formula, as the People of the Sun and People of the Stars campaigns introduce many additional elements that twist this formula. From the moment you open the rulebook, the story begins with your starting 4 survivors waking up on the Plane of Faces, lanterns lit in hand, knowing nothing. From there, the survivors are attacked by one of the game world's initial threats, the White Lion. The White Lion is a hulking albino monster with taloned human hands for paws and a feral unsated hunger for survival flesh. As such, your survivors are cast into their first showdown phase against this foe, where in a 4 versus 1 battle of 4 nearly naked survivors armed with a stone-faced chunk, a loincloth, and sheer desperation, face off against the bestial predator. This battle is meant to be rudimentary, a rare but welcomed blessing in this world, with much of the extra considerations of the usual combat structure like terrain features and additional survival action options removed. However, it will certainly suffice to teach you the general flow of combat that remains consistent throughout the rest of the game. Combat in the Showdown phase takes place on this massive square-covered showdown board, usually with the monster taking center stage and your survivors being set a certain number of spaces away from it. The board looks a bit barren here, but most battles involve the inclusion of terrain features that offer interaction opportunities and broaden your tactical choices. For example, the White Lion battle beyond the prologue fight generally involves the tall grass terrain, which allows survivors to hide in its stalks to gain a bonus toward evading inbound attacks, or spend an action to hide from the monster outright. Generally, 1 or 2 more random terrain features are also added to change the landscape of each battle, meaning one White Lion encounter stage is not necessarily the same as another. The terrain setup for each battle is dictated by the encounter's setup diagram in the hardcover story/rulebook, and this first fight is no different. However, different effects and abilities in the game can augment the standard setup for future battles. Perhaps the beast caught your scent and gets to ambush you when the fight begins, or perhaps you found the beast chowing down on the remains of another animal, allowing your survivors the ambush. Generally though, all figures start in the outlined starting zones and the battle ensues as though the combatants have stumbled upon one another, Pokemon style. The monster always gets to go first during the monster turn, followed by the survivor turns wherein all 4 survivors take their individual turns, then back to the monster turn and so on. Monster turns are pretty simple. You just draw the topmost AI card from the monster's shuffled AI deck and do what it says. Most AI cards outline a list of targeting priorities at the top, followed by what to do to the chosen target on bottom. These AI cards are performed immediately and then go to the AI discard pile. For instance, this White Lion's claw attack will attempt to target the closest threat facing in range first. If no one applies to that targeting condition, the lion will instead attempt to target the closest threat in field of view next. If no one still applies to that targeting condition, the White Lion will resolve its no target effect, Sniff. Determining which survivors potentially apply to these targeting criteria requires a foreknowledge of the game's terminology, which is succinctly explained in the rulebook, but suffice it to say that this card will generally try to target the nearest survivor figure who is considered a threat, or perform an alternative action if no survivors in its targeting parameters are considered threats. The other main types of AI cards are mood and trait cards, which remain in play and generally provide an ongoing benefit to the monster. For example, the White Lion's Enraged mood card grants the White Lion a +1 damage buff until a survivor suffers a severe injury. Yikes! Each monster in the game has its own proprietary AI deck that dictates its tactics and attacks, adding unique flavor to the usual move and attack AI commonly seen in cooperative board games. The White Lion here has a variety of claw-like scratch and slash attacks, but it can also grab and drag survivors away from the group with its haunting human hands, retreat to lick its wounds, and gain passive benefits from a range of potential mood cards. The White Lion is one of the simpler monsters in the game, but trust me, the AI effects of the other monsters and nemesis in the game get insane. Surprises abound from even innocuous appearing threats. The next monster in the game, the Screaming Antelope, looks like an oversized elk with burning orange eyes. Strange, but it's just an antelope, right? Well, it's an oversized antelope that can kick you across the map, produce hypersonic wails that can deafen you or drive you to a mental break, trample you underfoot with crushing strength, spread its diseased ticks to melee attackers, and even attempt to devour you whole through its nasty, giant-toothed undermouth that stretches the length of its torso. And that's before adding in the super dangerous stuff at levels 2 and level 3 forms. Interestingly, even if you fight the same monster multiple times, you'll have a different battle experience each time you face it. Each boss has pools of basic, advanced, and legendary tier AI cards, and only a random few from each tier are shuffled together for each fight. In this case, the level 1 White Lion takes 7 basic tier AI cards from the basic card pool, and 3 advanced tier AI cards from its advanced card pool to form its AI deck, whereas a level 2 White Lion would take 10 basic AI cards and 5 advanced tier cards. Therefore, you won't get the same basic, advanced, and legendary card mix even when you have the same raw card counts for each tier, meaning that you'll have different threats to face despite facing the same technical monster type. Also interestingly, the monster's AI deck doubles as the monster's life points, which is another neat idea. As such, whenever your survivor deals a wound to the monster, remove the topmost card from the AI deck from the game, thereby depriving the monster of whatever attack or ability that it otherwise would have resolved with that card. This means that sometimes you can get lucky and remove an advanced or legendary card before the monster gets a chance to unleash it. Or, you might just remove a basic card, and the advanced or legendary card beneath will punch your teeth in on the next monster turn. Additionally, by culling its AI pool like this, the monster will fall back on the cards that remain in its deck with increased frequency, which could be bad if those cards are advanced or legendary cards. Thankfully, there are items that allow you to manipulate and look at the cards in the AI deck, lending some strategy to when you might want to wound the monster and remove a card, versus when you might want to hold off and keep a less dangerous AI card around. Once all cards in the enemy's deck have been removed through wounds, you just have to deal the monster one more wound to defeat it. Whenever the monster resolves an attack against a survivor, that survivor will usually have to roll a number of 10-sided dice as indicated by the attack's speed stat. For each die with a roll result equal to or higher than the accuracy stat indicated on the attack, the monster scores a successful hit on your survivor. With multi-dice attacks, it's possible that the monster may score multiple hits on your survivor. In the case of this claw attack, the White Lion will roll 2 10-sided dice, looking for values of 2+ on each of those dice. Then, for each successful hit the monster lands, the attacked survivor takes 1 damage to a body location by rolling the 6-sided body dice. Each body die roll will dictate where the monster's attack hits the survivor, ranging from the survivor's head to their torso, their waist, their arms, or their legs. Once the body location for each hit has been determined, damage from that attack is assigned, pursuant to the attack's listed damage stat. This claw card only deals 1 damage per hit, which isn't too bad, but stronger attacks can deal multiple damage points per hit. That said, survivors are not helpless to damage based purely on these rolls. There are a myriad of methods for mitigation and modification available to survivors through gear and experience, but we're only covering the general scope of things here without wandering too far out into the weeds. One deviation I will mention, given its massive influence in the game's strategy, are the survival actions. As your survivors learn and grow more familiar with the nature of their world, their survival instincts will sharpen accordingly, allowing them to use adaptive actions and respond to familiar threats. Survivors will accrue survival points at various means of spending them, allowing them to perform special reactions like dodging enemy hits, performing additional actions, performing additional movements, standing up a knockdown survivor, and so on. These special survival actions are also unique in that they could be performed at special intervals outside of the user's turn. These mid-turn actions are sort of similar to how the Overwatch abilities resolve in XCOM, wherein the responding figure performs the responsive action midway through whatever the active figure is doing. Instead of using the standard health points model seen in most tactical combat games, each survivor's body locations will list an armor stat on your character sheet. In the prologue fight, you will only have 1 armor at your waist location due to your loincloth starting gear card, leaving everything else exposed. Damage to each body location is assigned to its armor points first, then any remainder goes toward the location's injury boxes. The smaller box indicates a light injury, which incurs no penalty on its own. The bold box indicates a heavy injury, which causes your survivor figure to be knocked down. If both of these injury boxes are filled and a body location takes further damage, you will have to roll a d10 on the severe injury chart for that location, which often results in permanent injuries and debilitations resultant from the trauma inflicted there. A survivor arm injury, for example, might result in a broken arm which reduces your innate strength stat. Or, on a worse roll, you might find that your arm has been dismembered entirely, precluding you from wielding two-handed gear. And on a really bad roll, some severe injury results can even cause you to die. A few of these severe injury results can also cause you to develop mental disorders, which you draw from a shuffled deck of mental disorder cards. Mental disorders generally impose debuffs or bizarre conditions upon your character until they're treated. These remind me a lot of the trauma system in the Darkest Dungeon video game. As a demonstrative example, the Hoarder disorder causes a survivor to steal one of the post-battle resources earned for defeating monsters, depriving the settlement of that asset. Honorable, on the other hand, will preclude you from attacking a monster from the blind spot or whenever it's knocked down, and Hemophobia causes you to suffer knockdown whenever a survivor is given bleed tokens. Needless to say, severe injuries can be pretty terrifying, so they're best avoided when possible by trying to distribute the monster's damage output across multiple survivors or onto one of your tank characters. The perceptive of you may have also noticed that there's technically one more damage area on the character sheet that I failed to mention prior, the brain. The brain is not on the body location die because the damage dealt to this location is more mental in nature. When your survivor encounters horrific sights, sounds, and thoughts, their mental fortitude will be challenged via damage dealt to the brain location. Your brain's defense from suffering a mental breakdown in this world is, in fact, insanity points. The more insane you are, the more resilient you are to the horrors assailing your mind, though being too insane can be bad in other ways. Unlike armor gear that has a static armor value, your survivor's insanity value fluctuates freely with no maximum, which is partially good because if you suffer mental damage without sufficient insanity points to soak it, you'll be rolling on a brain trauma chart much like the severe injury chart, so be mindful. Back to the realm of physical wounds, you might be thinking to yourself, your survivors get 4 chances at attack while the monster only gets to play 1 AI card? It seems like 4-to-1 attacks per round is stacked in the favor of the survivors. Well, setting aside the fact that AI cards can sometimes end with the additional AI card plays, don't be fooled into this false sense of security. Indeed, while the monster usually only plays 1 AI card per monster turn, the monster can be quite active during the survivor's turns as well. Each monster in the game comes with a unique hit location deck, HL deck for short, that is used when survivors hit the monster. Hit location cards detail what location the survivor struck with their weapon, as well as what reactions the monster may perform after the wound attempt. We'll talk about the survivor attacks more thoroughly in a moment, but suffice it to say for now that successful hits from survivor attacks result in drawing and resolving hit location cards. Some of these hit location reactions are good, like how a good conk to the lion's noggin can knock the kitty over, causing it to ignore its usual reactions and making it easier to hit. Or a strong strike to the leg can reduce its movement, or a crit on the lion's gut could potentially cause its intestines to fall out. However, other hit location cards can cause the monster to do other things, like run away from you mid-attack, or enrage it and cause it to slash back at you, or knock you over, or make you its priority target for the remainder of battle. These adaptive responses from the monster really give each beastie some excellent thematic flavor. Thankfully, certain gear items in the game will allow you to modify and look at hit location cards so you can plan which survivor attack order is best suited to deal with the potential responses from the monster. For instance, a hit location response that causes an adjacent survivor to be knocked down might be best handled by a survivor attacking at range. After a hit location card is resolved, it goes to the hit location discard pile, which will eventually reshuffle back into the hit location deck and potentially give you another go at that hit location later on. Some critical wound effects can remove certain hit location cards from the game, so the hit location deck contents can change throughout the course of the showdown, but most of them will hang around for better or worse. I also really commend the designers for the thematic interactions between certain hit location consequences and their impact on the monster's AI capabilities. Damage dealt to some hit locations can result in persistent injuries that affect the monster's ability to resolve certain AI parameters. For example, if you crit the White Lion's Strange Hand card, you hack the hand off with a hefty blow. With its Strange Hand dismembered, the White Lion's AI capabilities will reflect this change. As you can see, if the Lost Hand persistent injury is active, Vicious Claw gains a new resolution text that follows suit with the continuity of the persistent injury, causing the lion to look longingly at the stump of its arm where its hand used to be, rather than attacking you with it. Each monster hit location deck also contains one unique trap card, which indicates that the monster was ready for your attack and responds accordingly. Trap cards immediately cancel your attack and cause the monster to perform a unique attack or ability, after which the hit location discard pile is shuffled back into the hit location deck. I sometimes fear the hit location cards more than certain AI cards, since usually you're able to plan what to do about an AI card with some advance notice, whereas hit location responses can sometimes throw a wrench into your plans. Okay, we've covered a lot of what the monsters can do, but what can the survivors do? During the prologue fight, survivors can mostly just move and attack, but as they grow throughout the campaign, craft new gear, gain fighting arts, weapon proficiencies, and other roguelike buffs from various events, each survivor's respective abilities and role functions will grow. Survivors start out with a base movement of 5 spaces, and each survivor is allotted 1 movement activation and 1 action per turn. Movement is calculated orthogonally, meaning it is measured in spaces up, down, left, or right from the current space. Attack ranges for ranged weapons are calculated in like fashion, meaning that diagonal spaces count as 2 spaces away and are therefore not adjacent for melee attacks. Don't ask me why. I should note that each monster also has a blind spot, or a weak spot from which the survivors can avoid being targeted by many AI card attacks and gain survivor attack bonuses, so movement into these zones before resolving attack actions is generally recommended, though some monsters can punish you for staying in those spaces too long. Survivor attacks work similarly to how monster attacks do. When resolving a survivor attack, choose a weapon in that survivor's gear grid, and then roll the indicated number of dice per the weapon's speed stat. Smaller weapons like knives, shivs, and katars tend to have higher speed stats but lower strength stats, whereas larger weapons like clubs and hammers tend to have lower speed but higher strength. After the dice are rolled, compare your roll results to the weapon's listed accuracy stat, portrayed as an X plus value under the weapon's speed stat. The Founding Stone here has a 7 plus listed as its accuracy stat, meaning that roll values of 7, 8, 9, and Lantern 10 result in successful hits. If attacking from the monster's blind spot, you get to add +1 accuracy to your roll, which means that you would also hit on a 6 as well. For each successful roll, draw 1 card from the hit location deck. Unfortunately, hitting the monster is not the same as wounding the monster. While you can hit the beast's paw or slice at the beast's brow, you might only end up scoring a glancing blow which deals inconsequential damage that doesn't result in a full-on wound. After drawing the hit location cards for your attack, you resolve them one by one in the order of your choosing, by selecting a hit location card, rolling a d10, adding any strength bonuses, and comparing the final value to the monster's toughness stat. For example, the Founding Stone here has listed a value of 1 strength, so I only get to add 1 to my wound roll result. The Prologue Lion has a toughness value of 6, meaning I would need to roll a 5+ on this wound roll to successfully wound the monster with this weapon. If successful, I get to remove the topmost AI card from the AI deck and resolve any wound responses listed on the hit location card. If I fail to meet or exceed the toughness value, I failed to wound the monster with my strike and I resolve any failure responses on the hit location card. Reflex responses happen whether I wound the monster or not, which makes them particularly troublesome responses. Lastly, if you manage to roll a Lantern 10 when resolving a wound roll, it's counted as an automatic success, and you'll get to perform any critical wound effects listed on the hit location card instead of the usual wound, fail, or reflex responses. Critical wounds, as you might have guessed, are super wounds that generally cause debuffs or debilitations to the monster for the remainder of battle. Otherwise, they can also net you benefits like additional monster resources for the settlement phase, which we'll get into in the next section. Mercifully, there is no set survivor turn order, so you get to choose what the survivor turn order is each round. For example, if you know that the trap is the next card in the hit location deck, perhaps it would be best to have your tank go next to attack the monster and tank the trap, or use a ranged attack from a survivor who is out of range of the trap effect. After all 4 survivors take their turn, play proceeds back to the monster turn, and the cycle continues until either the survivors are all dead or the monster is. And that's the broad overview of combat, minus terrain interactions, special conditions, or the increased tactical considerations afforded by gear and abilities you'll eventually get. If the monster is defeated, each living survivor will earn a series of rewards for that battle. First, each survivor marks 1 hunt XP on their character sheets, bringing them 1 step closer to their next age milestone. Age milestones allow you to gain age bonuses pursuant to a roll chart, which can permanently increase your character stats and usually net you with at least 1 fighting art. Fighting arts come from a shuffled fighting arts deck and grant any number of unique bonuses to the survivor, including attack buffs, new survival actions, and other special characteristics. Each survivor can maintain up to 3 fighting arts throughout the course of the campaign, and since the fighting art deck is randomized, everyone's fighting arts will be different. Some of these can be game changers for the character, incentivizing them to switch to a new build to capitalize on the new benefits. Secret fighting arts are also accessible throughout special events, and those could be massively powerful boons. I haven't said much about the survivor's innate stat values yet, and that's because all of those values, except movement, are 0 for the prologue fight, but now's a good time to talk about them. These stats can rise and fall pursuant to various game effects, either temporarily or permanently, and they each affect your survivor's combat efficacy. Each survivor has 6 primary stats: movement, accuracy, strength, evasion, luck, and speed. Most folks who are familiar with stats in games will know what's going on here, but when I started out, I certainly didn't. Movement was pretty straightforward, but the other combat stats really dizzied me at first. But once I sat down and focused on the keywords themselves, each stat boiled down to a fairly intuitive sequence. Speed dictates how many hits you can put on a monster during an attack. Accuracy dictates how precise you were in hitting your marks with those attacks. Strength dictates how hard you hit each spot. Luck dictates whether you struck a nerve or a vital spot. And evasion dictates how hard it is for you to be hit yourself. For the most part, the same holds largely true for the monster's attack stats. Looking back at the claw card again, we can see that the monster's speed dictates how many hits it can put on its targets, its accuracy dictates how precise it was in hitting its mark with its attacks, and its strength or damage is how hard it can hit each spot. In this regard, once you understand one, you basically understand the other by extension. So let's break these out to solidify the distinction through an example of the stats at work. The movement stat indicates how many spaces you can move during your survivor's movement activation. Unlike the other stats, which are modifiers, this is a straightforward metric. Therefore, with a movement value of 5, this survivor may move up to 5 spaces with a move action. In this case, I will move my survivor 5 spaces toward the monster so I can attack it from the blind spot with my Founding Stone weapon. A survivor's speed stat modifies the number of dice you roll when trying to hit, not wound, the monster. For review, each weapon has a built-in speed stat that lists the number of dice you roll that can net you hits on the monster. Positive values in your survivor's speed stat therefore increase the number of dice you roll for hit rolls, and negative values reduce the number of dice you roll for hit rolls. So, if my survivor has 1 in his innate speed stat, he will roll 3 dice when making an attack with the Founding Stone instead of the usual 2. A survivor's accuracy stat modifies the actual roll results of your hit rolls, not wound rolls. For review, hit rolls are the initial attack rolls that use your speed stat to dictate the number of hit location cards you try to wound with your attack. Positive values in this stat add to those hit roll results, negative values detract from those results. Therefore, if my survivor has 1 in his accuracy stat, my hit roll results of 6 and 8 would be hits, but my 2 would be a miss, so I will get to draw 2 hit location cards for my wound attempt. The strength stat modifies the roll results of your wound rolls, not your hit rolls. For review, these are the rolls that you make to resolve the hit location cards you draw from successful hits. You resolve wound rolls one at a time in any order of your choosing by rolling a d10 and comparing the value to the monster's toughness stat. Positive values in this stat add to the wound roll results, whereas negative values detract from these results. Therefore, if my survivor has 1 in his strength stat, a roll result of 4 with the Founding Stone will wound the 6 toughness prologue lion. 4 from the roll result, plus 1 from the weapon's innate strength value, plus my 1 survivor strength. But a roll result of 3 or fewer will not. Luck is a unique stat that modifies your critical wound range. Normally you deal critical wounds on a wound roll, not a hit roll, of a Lantern 10, but positive values in this stat allow you to crit on other roll results. For example, a 1 in luck lets you crit on a 9 or a 10, giving you 20% crit chance for each wound attempt. A 2 in this luck stat crits on 8, 9, and 10, and so on. This is a very rare stat for a character to increase, but very worth it. Lastly, the evasion stat modifies the accuracy value of monster attacks, making it more difficult for the monster to hit you. I find it best to imagine that this stat is a monster accuracy penalty. Positive values in this stat increase the roll requirements for monster attacks to hit you. Negative values make it easier for the monster to hit you. Therefore, if my survivor has 2 in his evasion stat, this monster AI card hits him on a 4+ roll result instead of the printed 2+. By your first age milestone, you'll unlock your survivor's weapon proficiency path. You get to pick which weapon type your character will pursue proficiency ranks in, spanning from swords, daggers, bows, spears, katars, clubs, axes, shields, katanas, scythes, grand weapons, or even unarmed combat, and likely 1 or 2 I'm forgetting here. Once you have your weapon type selected, you'll be able to check a box in the proficiency track at the end of each battle where you dealt at least one wound to the monster with that weapon type. Once you reach the bolded milestones on this track, you'll gain access to new bonuses and abilities specific to that weapon type. You won't have access to these options from the prologue fight, but it's worth addressing here regardless. Lastly, you'll gain glorious monster resources from the corpse of the creature before you. Each monster has its own unique resource deck, and there's also a deck of basic resources that are shared across all monsters. Resources are used for crafting gear and expanding your settlement, so these are the most valuable battle rewards from a long-term perspective. Prologue and level 1 lines tend to net you 4 basic resources and 4 White Lion resources, drawn from the tops of their respective shuffled decks. Some critical wound effects and hunt events can also net you specific resources, adding to the number of resources you're able to acquire during the usual fight. Resources tend to come in 5 primary categories: hide, bone, organ, hybrid, which is a resource that counts as any of the previous 3, and other, with branching keywords and subcategories for a few unique resource types like scrap or vermin. We'll go over what all these resources can be used for in the next section. The higher level monster you take down, the more resource rewards you gain from fighting it, and certain exclusive resources required for powerful gear only spawn on higher level monster encounters, which is a compelling incentive to work your way up the competence ladder to face them. After gathering your monster goodies, it's time to head home to the settlement, your survivor's chosen place of refuge in this forsaken land. In the People of the Lantern campaign, the survivors settle around the Lantern Horde, a mysterious, bright tower of lanterns whose hazed luminescence repels the darkness and fills the survivors with something akin to hope. From there, open the settlement board and resolve the various settlement steps shown on it. While there won't be a whole lot to do on the first 1 or 2 settlement phases, believe me, these will grow more involved as your campaign progresses. I should note that there are some special steps that occur during the very first settlement phase in the campaign, but I'm skipping over those items to focus on the general settlement phase overview. First order of business, the survivors who made it through the showdown return to the settlement victorious. This will refill their armor points and erase any failed injury boxes, a welcomed and needed reprieve no doubt. This will not, however, remove any severe injuries or disorders they picked up. Next, each survivor that returned from the showdown will earn 1 Endeavor token from the settlement, which can be spent to perform various actions in the following settlement steps. After that, you check the next box in the timeline printed on the settlement sheet. The timeline tracks your campaign progress in Lantern years, an undefined amount of time, and I'm pretty sure that time in their world doesn't operate at the same rate as it does in ours, especially considering as Lantern years go by, you'll encounter new challenges and events that progress the narrative of the game. Each time you check the next box on the timeline, you'll resolve a settlement event card from the shuffled settlement events deck. Simply draw one of them at random and resolve accordingly. These can vary pretty wildly, detailing special interactions between survivors, visiting entities from unknown regions, bizarre manifestations, or any number of zany things. One of my favorite settlement events is the Triathlon of Death, which pits 4 survivors in a series of stat-based competitions that net various prizes and penalties depending on where each survivor falls in the rankings. Settlement events are a broad spectrum of surprise, with events shaking out as good, bad, really bad, or somewhere in between. You never really know what to expect each Lantern year since they're randomized, but that's part of the fun. New settlement event cards can be added to this deck when playing with certain expansions as well, adding even more variety and potential terror. Then, resolve any story events listed for that Lantern year, which can bring new blessings to your settlement, add new huntable monsters to your list of quarries, cause special nemesis battles to ensue, or add new discoveries to unfold. The nature of these story events changes pretty drastically depending on which campaign you're playing, as the narrative and happenings of each is pretty different, but one thing remains the same: the world threats get tougher as time goes on. Following the settlement events, you'll need to update the death count on your settlement record sheet. If anyone perished since the last time you updated the death count, indicate that here by checking a box on the death track and removing the deceased from the population record. When your settlement suffers its first casualty, you'll be prompted to perform the Death Principle story event, in which you decide how your society will handle survivor deaths. If you choose the path of cannibalism, you are able to harvest resources from fallen survivors. If you choose the path of graves, you are able to gain additional endeavors when friends succumb to the terrors of the world. You will also discover additional principal milestones with similar choices as the campaign unfolds, but that's all I'll say on that for now. A quick note about death. If a survivor dies at any point of the campaign and they're wearing gear, the gear is not lost unless specifically stated otherwise. You retain gear from fallen survivors that you can pass on to others, which is a point of comfort when your heavily built tank suddenly dies. Since survivors can be, expendable in this world, a sizable portion of a survivor's capabilities come from their gear, meaning you aren't entirely reset if a high-level character meets a bitter fate. Next, it's time for you to choose how to spend those endeavors and resources in the development step. There's no strict order for how to spend your resources or endeavors. You may simply spend them as desired. Often, one of the first things I do most Lantern years is perform the Lantern Horde's Innovate action, which costs 1 endeavor and 1 bone, 1 hide, and 1 organ. Innovation is how you unlock new advancements in your settlement development tree and progress as a civilization. The first innovation is given freely, language, which allows your survivors to communicate and puts the starting innovation cards into the innovation deck. Normally, when you innovate, you get to draw the top 2 cards from the innovation deck and choose one to keep, shuffling the other back into the deck. Each innovation card unlocks new benefits for your settlement, including new survivor action options for combat, increasing certain stats, providing new endeavor token activities, or even allowing you to build new settlement locations that introduce new crafting recipes. And, of course, the starting innovations branch out to other more advanced innovations like a traditional tech tree, adding new innovation cards to the innovation deck for future discovery. For example, if I innovated this ammonia innovation, my people have stepped into the world of science and can pursue its discoveries. As indicated on the ammonia card, I'd be able to add the ammonia consequence innovations to the innovations deck for future science-related innovations. In order to start crafting gear, you'll have to build the Bonesmith, the Skinnery, and the Organ Grinder settlement locations for 1 endeavor token apiece, which will grant you access to their crafting recipes going forward. The Bonesmith is where starting weapons are made: bone daggers, bone darts, bone swords, bone axes, bone clubs, you get the picture. The Skinnery is where starting armor sets are made, along with a few other useful nicks and knacks. The Organ Grinder is a hodgepodge of build buffing items that increase stats and grant access to unique abilities. But this is just the start of your settlement locations. As you progress in the campaign, you'll gain access to new locations that can build stronger gear with new abilities. And remember how each monster has its own AI, hit location, and resource decks? Well, each monster also has its own settlement crafting location with a list of unique armor, weapons, and items craftable from that monster's resources. And that's not all, but I'll leave the other locations and their potential for your own discovery. As you can see on the settlement location cards, each craftable gear item lists the resources required for building that item. To build those items, simply discard the required resources and gain the corresponding gear card. Thankfully, multiple copies of each gear item can be crafted. I could go on and on for hours about the various builds and meta strategies for optimizing certain bits and bobs in the game, but at least for me, part of the fun of the game was finding these combinations on my own. With all the options available throughout the course of the game, you'll have plenty to work with. I should say this though, items and builds are more than just a mishmashed assembly of gear cards that you like. I mean, you could play that way if you wanted, but you'd be bypassing some excellent tactical tools if you mindlessly mesh your gear together. One of the lauded mechanics of the game is actually its unique gear management system. Each survivor may equip up to 9 gear cards in a 3x3 grid that represents their loadout. However, the placement of these cards in the grid is a small management mini-meta game, as each gear piece has certain colored affinity markers on the edges of their cards. Gear cards often reward you with additional perks and abilities for having certain color connection combinations in your gear grid. For example, this Monster Grease item grants +1 evasion on its own, but connecting 3 green squares on your gear grid allows it to gain additional evasion. I should also mention here that having a full set of armor equipped also nets you with the unique armor set bonus, granting you additional armor points and giving you access to a unique action or specific ability for the armor set. Now, you don't have to spend all your resources each settlement phase. You can save your remaining resources by writing them on the settlement record sheet and returning all resource cards back to their respective decks. Endeavors, however, are lost at the end of the settlement phase, so it's encouraged for you to spend them when you can. It's too bad that you can only innovate once per lantern year, but I think that was the right call from a pacing perspective. Usually, if I have leftover endeavors, I attempt augury in pursuit of having new survivor babies, which is the primary means by which you expand your population. Naturally, because nothing can be easy in this world, childbirth itself is a potentially perilous endeavor, though it can also yield pleasantly surprising results as well. Lastly, choose a monster from your list of available quarries, select your departing survivors, and gear them up and send them into the darkness in pursuit of their chosen prey. That is, unless you have a nemesis showdown on the timeline for that year, in which case you'll depart to face them instead. And if that's the case, well,
brace yourself.
For the majority of the campaign, though, you'll head out to hunt a monster. You get to pick which level of monster you'll be facing, ranging from levels 1 to 3, which will scale its abilities and core stats accordingly. I don't have any hard tips for when exactly your survivors will be ready to move from level 1 prey to level 2 or level 2 to level 3, but adapting the famous words of an animated turtle of good character,
well, you never really know, but when they know, you'll know, you know? Oh.
Regardless of which level the monster you set out for, you'll proceed to the hunt phase. Which brings us to the last and thankfully shortest section regarding the hunt phase. When the hunt begins, the monster encounter entry in the book will show you how to set up the hunt board that's conveniently printed on the back of the settlement board. From here, you'll set your group of departing survivors on the leftmost space, place a series of event cards out on the board per the diagram on the encounter page, and set the monster miniature on the indicated space matching its level. Notice that there are two types of events, monster events and random hunt events. These spaces with the monster sigil will have one of the 8 shuffled monster cards placed on them, whereas every other open space will lead to a random hunt event. The textured space in the middle of the hunt track, labeled Overwhelming Darkness, is an exception, wherein you will resolve the Overwhelming Darkness story event instead of the standard hunt event. On the hunt board, survivors will take turns moving their group toward the space with the monster and resolving the hunt events on each space in between. When moving into a space with a monster hunt event card, simply flip the card and resolve its text accordingly. Otherwise, you'll be instructed to roll 2 d10 dice together, one representing the 10's value and the second representing the 1's value, and resolve the corresponding random hunt event from the storybook. For example, if my 10's dice rolled an 8 and my 1's dice rolled a 3, I would resolve hunt event number 83. But wait a minute, what even is a hunt event? Great question. Hunt events tell the story of what your survivors encounter in the world on their way to their quarry. Each event details some small encounter that the participants are put through. Perhaps the party encounters the remains of fallen survivors and gains some resources, or maybe they come across a mysterious statue that one of your survivors is compelled to touch, or possibly the stone faces beneath you appear to be whispering, prompting you to listen to their message. Generally, hunt events give you some sort of narrative description, followed by a roll of some sort to determine the outcome. There are 100 random hunt events, plus the monster-specific hunt events, leading to quite a bit of variety. You never really know what you're going to get from hunt events, so I'd say this phase tends to be the most random part of the experience. And through its randomness, some of the emergent storytelling shines forth in unexpected ways, like Mad Libs of Death. Early on in one of my first campaigns, my hunt group of Judas, Isaac, Chastity, and Charity were making their way toward a level 1 white lion. In one hunt event, we came across a field of consuming grass, whatever that was. Most everyone made it through without trouble, but Chastity had some struggles traversing the grassy spine field. She ended up having to roll a d10 on a chart, resulting in the following. Quote, "You fall, but you manage to interpose something between the grass and your bare skin. Either archive one gear of your choice from your gear grid to protect yourself, or treat this result as if you rolled a 1. And believe me, that 1 was bad news. Given how early in the game we were, the only gear I had on was a starting loincloth, meaning I had to remove it from the game to protect her from the grass blades, leaving her entirely exposed for all to see, a small irony considering her namesake. Perhaps she would have had better fortune if her name were Modesty instead. I didn't plan in any way for this to happen. Heck, I didn't even know something like this could happen, and yet it did, as though the game itself were tormenting me. The group found it quite humorous until the lion tore off her leg and mauled her defenseless form promptly thereafter. Anyway, once you reach the space with your quarry, the showdown begins. Follow the setup instructions in the encounter diagram and kick some lion tail or antelope tail, or maybe ducktail. And that's it. The phases loop from here in a wash, rinse, repeat sort of cycle through the lantern years until you make it to the end of the campaign or your settlement population is wiped out. This might be hard to believe, but even all of what we covered here doesn't capture everything the game has to offer. I didn't even get into the legendary weapon stuff, rare gear, terrain tidbits, courage and understanding, the savior system, or the Twilight Sword and Twilight Knight stuff. There's so much to unpack with this game, and that's just with the core box. There are a bevy of excellent expansions that add new monsters, nemesis, mechanics, and campaigns, all for your playing enjoyment. And remember, a monster expansion isn't just a monster mini. It's the monster, its AI, hit location, hunt event decks, a full armory of monster-specific gear from a settlement location, timeline and story events, innovations, settlement events, new mechanics, and usually a few other surprises here and there too. So these expansions are packed to the brim in case you weren't already inundated with content. So that leaves us with the question we started with. What is Kingdom Death Monster? Well, on paper, it's a cooperative tactical combat horror game with civilization progression and light RPG character progression mechanics. But it's not just a cooperative tactical combat horror game with just civilization progression and light RPG character progression. The essence of KDM is a vast branching network of interlocking systems, coalescing into a beautiful, if harrowing, experience unlike any other on the market. It's a journey into a world of madness and mystery, a bizarre landscape in which I regularly get lost both intellectually and imaginarily. And, at least for me, the game is a story engine. Each of our main survivors ends up a fully fleshed out character in my mind by the end of the campaign, with quirks, personality, and history solely portrayed through the gameplay and a little imaginative context. I think for me, that's a decent chunk of what sets it so far above other dungeon crawlers with tactical combat. The world and art are super engaging, in perhaps a sick way for which I should seek help, setting my mind running through the possibilities of what unimaginable terrors the shadows around the Lantern Horde can hold. The nightmarish creatures like the Gorm, the Titan Bee, and the brain-liquefying Screaming God. The powerful entities like the Hand, the King, and Atlas the Child Eater. The unique locales like the Inverted Mountain and the Abyssal Woods. The whole worldscape is dripping with imagination and nightmare fuel in equal parts. I never thought I'd play a game that has me sky fishing for sun sharks, or swallowing sword beetles that'll either buff my strength stat or have my internal organs snipped out from the inside, or eagerly dancing with my own schizophrenic hallucination, or having a monster retch all over me and somehow enjoy the experience. The stuff in this game is nuts, but in a captivating way that keeps me coming back for more, and sometimes even imagining what adventures I'd insert into the experience. The quality custom content scene for this game is chock full of excellent additions, by the way. Despite the game's massive scope, it doesn't actually require a calculus degree to play. Most of the iconography and text is pretty intuitive, with many of the keywords and mechanics defined on the cards in which they're used. A sizable chunk of the game's resolution, fundamentally, boils down to read the thing and do what it says. There's some simple math in the game, but I found it quickly becomes second nature after a battle or two, and the various tokens and trackers really help keep things straight without bogging down the board experience too much. But more than anything I can say or show here, the best method of seeing what KDM has to offer is simply to give it a go yourself. I had never heard of Kingdom Death Monster until I played it at a friend's house, and I've been hooked ever since. It could be tricky to get a hold of a physical copy these days since the game is currently between prints, and certainly pricey, but I know I've received my money's worth from it. And I'll close by stating adamantly that while this game is certainly not for everyone, it's certainly the game for me. Oof, we made it! Thank y'all so much for watching. I hope you're able to glean some insight into what makes this game stand out. I'm sorry it took me so long to piece this project together, but I felt it would be unfair to the game for me to rush it. As crazy as it seems, there was so much more I wanted to say about the game, but I had to condense my script a few times to keep the overview from being bogged down on any one topic for too long. As such, now that you've learned the theory and gear work behind Kingdom Death,
Now, you are ready.
For what?
A new beginning.
Indeed, I think it's about time to see it in application. Mind you, there are plenty of quality playthroughs of Kingdom Death campaigns all across YouTube, but I must admit ours is going to be pretty special for new viewers and Kingdom Death veterans alike. We'll be playing through a brand new, never-before-showcased campaign beta called The Scalding Seas, which leads us through the plights and perils of the people of the sea. For the first time in Kingdom Death history, survivors will settle on the stone-faced shoreline, with a full suite of new water-bound baddies, swimming and sailing mechanics, procedural weather and environmental effects, and so much more. Seriously, I've been waiting since late spring or maybe early summer of this year to actually get this expansion content up on the channel, and I'm so excited to finally be able to dive into it. So this is a long time coming for me. And a special thanks to Pyro Guy, or Tammer, the ambitious creator of this aquatic adventure, for giving us permission to take it for a spin. I think you'll agree once you watch it in motion that the fact that this came from the creative mind of one person is pretty impressive. Until next time, thanks for watching, friends.